Okay, guys, so we are here then on episode number 3. And today, we're going to be talking about creating awareness and finding your why. Now, we've spoke a little bit off air before this, and, I think you'll agree, Scott, that this is probably going to be quite a deep one, and we're going to go off on quite a few different pathways.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. A lot to explore.
I think it's a really, really important one, though, for so many people to understand exactly why they're doing what they're doing, and it's the reasons that gives you that drive behind it. So for the guys that are listening today, try and I'd probably task you actually to try and get a pen and paper and write a few things and ideas down as you go through this one. But Scott, I'm going to ask you first, let's explain the creating awareness. Like, what does it actually mean by creating awareness?
Okay, so the reason we've put these two topics together really and mentioned creating awareness and then finding your why is because they very much work off of each other, right? So the awareness process, the desire to create consciousness, is effectively the first step, the catalyst to finding your why, by understanding what underpins you to do what you do and what motivates you and drives you, right? And then from there, being able to utilize those things effectively and consistently to optimize performance. So awareness is the first step, right? Which we've mentioned quite a few times, I think, in past episodes, specifically in episode 1. And the goal here is very, very simple. It's just to start to notice bit by bit why you do the things you do, why you respond the way you respond, and to internalize that and start to ask questions, right?
Yeah, agree. And I think the important thing there as well is it's understanding that every single one of us is different, right? And we all have different reasons, like you say, that we respond in different ways. I mean, taking it back slightly to something that it will definitely stem from is how you're brought up and the things you see in life. I guess they're probably one of the ones, aren't they, that are gonna sort of show you the reasons why you see the things you see them like that. And I think being aware of your surroundings and the things that you've seen in your younger life is going to equal how you see things now. So I think one of the big things that I try and do personally is to try and train myself to see how I react to things as opposed to just reacting to them. I know as a youth, I just used to react to things straight away. But now I try and obviously think about things before I react to them. So I think that's one of the things, isn't it? Like to make sure you're aware of how you react to situations. It could be under pressure or the way someone talks to you or something like that. It's just it's about being aware of everything around you, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there's a few things from that, but the first is doing what you just described is an aspect of being aware, being conscious, right? It's kind of one of the offshoots is observing how you behave and actually making conscious decisions to kind of mitigate the chain of cause and effect, right? And make conscious decisions. So in this case, as you said, when you were younger, you reacted, right? The chain of cause and effect is very short, right? Immediate cause, immediate effect. The effect is you reacting, right? And you do this unconsciously. You're motivated by very basic unconscious stimulus. It may be, as you say, something more complex that's triggered you from your past, which we'll get into a little bit later, or it may be something evolutionary. It may be something, biochemical, hormonal, whatever, right? But the point is it's very fast, yeah? Whereas when you are responding versus reacting, there is a kind of a block in the chain of cause and effect. And that block is a moment of consciousness where you question what you're doing and, more importantly, why you're doing it, right? So if you start to do that, you then have, and this is, I think, a very important concept that I want to really communicate to everyone listening to this now, you actually create power and control where previously you did not have it, right? You have mastery over your own actions versus being almost enthralled to them, if you understand me.
Yeah, agree. And I think that is that whole point, isn't it, about the creating awareness? Because if you don't have that stop and think moment, then you're technically not creating awareness, are you? And that's the principle behind it.
Absolutely. And I think if you recall, one of the first conversations we actually had, we talked about this metaphor that I often use, which is the idea of being the pilot in your own plane versus the passenger, right? And that really is, if we want to think about it metaphorically, that is the ultimate goal of creating awareness as an individual, right? Let's be honest, like, we humans are very inconsistent creatures. We're never going to be perfect. We're never going to be completely conscious. You are going to have contradictory patterns, behave in ways that surprised you in certain circumstances. That's a given, right? But the more consciousness you can exert, the more you understand why you show up the way you do in certain circumstances, the more likely you are to be able to make choices that best suit who you are as a person or who you want to be, right? So you get ever closer to that idea of being the pilot of your own plane.
Yeah. What would you say is if there's any ways that people can, I guess, practices people can put into their life to create more awareness? Like, what would you say if there's anything, that we can do to help ourselves be more aware?
Well, I mean, there are a few kind of directions you can go with this, to be completely honest with you. Like, and it depends. It's up to the individual. What often helps, and this is something that you have kind of touched on already, is to take a little journey in your little time machine back to when you were, most probably a child, right? And to look how you behaved then. And the reason why I say this is because children's behavior is much more authentic. It's much more kind of natural, right? You're very responsive, and you're very reactive to the environment around you. You're not conditioned by the world in such a way that you are as an adult. You don't have like pre-existing kind of societal constraints. You're just you, right? And I'm speaking when you're young, kind of between when you first learn to speak, and then kind of when you're around 5, 6, 7, 8, and then things start to build, right? If you go back to significant memories, significant attachments that you may have had back then, that is where you first start to open doors into your unconscious, right? And this sounds very haphazard now, and it will, which is fine. But my point is simply to draw the correlation between who you are now and the journey that you've been on, right? Because a lot of people feel that they are complete when they're an adult. I've reached this point and this is who I am, period. It's done.
Yeah.
The journey's over, right? And you almost kind of stop in the moment and think like, okay, yeah, this is it. This is the way I am, right? But in reality, you have always been a constantly changing and inconsistent individual since this point back in time, right? So to draw attention to the past, to draw attention to how you responded to stressful situations when things were much more raw, things were much less biased, right? Starts to give you a little bit of insight into how you really feel about certain circumstances. And these things oftentimes are buried deep in our unconscious, because the brain's natural defense mechanism is to do exactly that, is to kind of subdue and bury experiences that you've had so that you can function in the present moment, right? And to try not to get too long-winded about this, but you tend to do this mostly with pain and suffering and trauma, right? And that's why, unfortunately, your moments of suffering and pain in your life, especially in your childhood, are the most significant indicators of growth, of where you came from and how you are likely to react in the present day, if you understand me.
Yeah. I think like that's something that I've been through with my therapist a lot. Like talking about how I was as a child, and I guess a lot of mindset stuff does dwindle back to childhood stuff, doesn't it? Because it's I guess as a child, the things we install stay with us, don't they, to a degree?
Mhm.
And that's why, I mean, they say, don't they? I mean, obviously, as you know, I've got two children. Leo's 1.5, Nelly's just turned 5 yesterday. But like for me, I'm always thinking about what they see, how they react, and all that sort of stuff, because I've read a lot about it basically, and I know how important it is. And I think, do they say between the ages 3 to 7 or something random like that, where is the time that they absorb everything? So that's their sort of like cognitive, like most cognitive spell or something like that. And
Mhm.
it's basically saying whatever is installed them at that age is what they will take with them. And again, I think that's something that we need to be more aware of, don't we, to understand. But that's that whole being aware, isn't it? It's not something that you can necessarily completely change, and you can't exactly change it quickly either. But to be able to to be able to be aware of it is what we're saying, isn't it? Like, to be aware of these things, that's the most powerful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when I answered your previous question, the point that I really wanted to exemplify is the fact that the the past has an enormous impact on the individual that you are. However, that the vast majority of the impact that it has is unconscious, something that you don't
Mm,
fully understand, right? And that to be honest, you don't really understand at all, and you ingrain into unconscious behaviors. And if we go to this react response paradigm, you repeat those things ad infinitum when you're faced with stimulus, right? So, and yes, you're completely correct with regards to that period of time. Like, that is the social learning kind of like threshold, where all a child is trying to do is it's trying to observe and then mimic in behavior, right? So that
mm,
it can function, because it's how we learn, right? The problem is when you are that young, similarly, you are trying to understand, but you actually don't understand, right?
yeah.
And no matter how wonderful a parent might be, that's simply a byproduct of your age and your point in the kind of developmental scale. Um, and what ends up happening is individuals make up stories, right? Like,
Mm,
my perspective on like one's individuality is that you are a person who is comprised of many stories, many
mm,
narratives, right? And your individual self is an unreliable narrator, right? Because it changes as it changes and changes and changes, right? um so then you all of a sudden you're 35, right? Time has passed
mm,
and you've told yourself a story or a series of stories that has changed over time, and that is what forms your beliefs about the world, who you are, what it means
yeah.
to be successful, what it means to have a positive relationship, what it means to blah 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 blah, right? To be you. But the thing
Mm,
is that these stories that you started telling yourself when you were tiny haven't changed. They've evolved as you've gotten older, but the root is still there, right? And that
yeah.
root can be very, very different to where it has ended up, even though you have zero comprehension of this. I try not to get too, off in the ether, but and the point is that there is so much material that's sitting in the unconscious unaddressed, right?
Mm,
And it can be traced back through time, which is why the first step to understanding who you are is to take a journey back through time, right? To
mm,
trace the trajectory and look at
yeah.
how that story might have changed.
Yeah. No, agree. And I guess obviously it can be quite a tough tough journey for some people.
Yeah,
I
oh,
know,
absolutely.
like, as I shared in the last episode, I know I've had a tough journey as such, because it's something, coming to terms with things, and being aware of things. Sometimes it can, like we said before, without going off into that, but like, being vulnerable is something you don't want to be, and it's a hard thing, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And that's a really, really, really good point, is that it really is a place of vulnerability, because the reason these stories have evolved, right, is because you have found a better alternative. Something has changed,
You've
circumstances have
mastered
changed.
it, mastered it up,
You've
haven't you?
got you've got older, you've concocted another, you know uh little paragraph in that story that has changed because you wanted it to, unconsciously, right?
Mm,
and
mm,
and that has happened and happened and happened over and over again. um so to go back and address it and to kind of question the reliability of yourself as a narrator, it's quite a difficult thing to do. It's effectively undermining yourself. It's saying you were wrong. This isn't right. Maybe I could have done this differently. Maybe I could have been different. I could have approached this situation differently. And that's horrible because obviously you can't change the past, right? But it's funny and it's interesting because it seems to be a human behavioral mechanism actually to defend the unreliable narrator. Like it is more satisfying to the ego and to the conscious, or the aspect of the conscious that is the ego, to satisfy it and to keep kind of placating it and saying, no, you're right. You haven't deceived yourself over time, than it is to acknowledge that perhaps something something could have improved back then. And then to make that conscious effort to go back and to kind of mark a fork in the road and change so that you can open yourself up to future growth, right? Which is unfortunately why most people stay in these patterns into their old age, and it never changes and it repeats on loop forever.
No, I agree. And that's, I guess that is that whole thing, isn't it, about trying to open up to it. And it's not necessarily meaning that it's your fault of what's happened in the past or how you've been brought up or anything like that, but it's just being aware of it, isn't it? And just making sure that you think about it as opposed to brush it under the carpet.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know what? If I could, actually, I'd like to give an example to kind of express the what I mean by this trajectory, because we've used a lot of words and we've used a lot of very kind of up in the air examples, and I want to make this kind of more clear, if I could. I'll mention myself in this case because, especially in the position that I'm in as a coach working with my clients, the most important thing you can do is have mastery of yourself first, right? You can't get to a position, in my opinion, where you're capable of taking on others' material, emotional battles without doing it yourself, right? So
agree.
I'll share one with you if that's okay. And
go.
One that pertains specifically to what we're talking about here, which is strength and performance and training, right? So for myself as a strength athlete, I've been involved in strength training since I was 15, but I certainly was not gifted in to be, I was a tiny, skinny, scrawny kid who was not strong in any capacity, right? But I've always wanted to be physically powerful, because I've always felt very confident as an individual that I am capable of anything, right? And when I was a lot younger, I suffered quite a difficult divorce. My parents separated when I was very small, and I didn't have much of a relationship with my father at all. And whilst this is almost a cliche, you don't have a good relationship with your dad, or you don't have much of a relationship with your dad, so you decide to become, masculine, hyper masculine strongman. That's not what I'm getting at. It's more, I didn't have a particularly good relationship with my dad because he was absent, but I wanted such a relationship. And as a result, because of the divorce, the role that I took in my family was one of a strong man. I took my dad's place effectively, right? I was a supporting role with my mom, with my little sister who was small, and I did that emotionally. I provided the role of the emotional rock, not physical, emotional, which is what made me, grow as a person and become very mentally tough. But I fell into that position of kind of emulating my father's role, and I think that translated physically because I wanted to be strong in every sense of the word. So when I went into sport, it wasn't enough for me to just be a good football player or a good rugby player. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to overcome obstacles physically, which is what I did. And it's amazing as a visual metaphor, like how that manifested physically. What do? I literally lift huge weights. I move physical obstacles in the most basic possible sense, right? And for me, that fulfilled that role of being the strong rock figure, the stable, powerful figure who helped overcome obstacles. But ultimately, I got to a point where I realized, like, there's some unresolved stuff here. Like my relationship with my father, the role that I took on, it's not healthy. I don't want to be that. That's not a position a child should be in. A child should feel supported. So I went back and I really addressed this thing with my dad and this relationship with my dad. And I really started to process a lot of the guilt that I felt almost being forced into that role by him, and the anger that I had towards him about being forced into that role as a kid, not having a choice. I had to do it. And I did it out of survival, right? And because at the time as well, I was starting to notice like training was becoming a survival mechanism for me. It wasn't necessarily something that I even enjoyed emotionally. It was something that I thought I had to do in a way to kind of keep myself going, And so I was like, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. I love training and I want to tap into that aspect of it that I love, not the aspect that makes me feel like I'm kind of going another day, surviving another day, So with all this kind of dissecting of that relationship with my dad, it actually ultimately led me to have a conversation with him about this. And really kind of acknowledging the kind of role that I took on and how it played out in my life and how vulnerable I felt and how frightened it made me feel, and how pigeonholed it made me feel. And that, ultimately led to kind of bleeding over into training. Like when he acknowledged that and he validated it and apologized to me and said that he wanted to take on that role more and that you didn't have to do this, that kind of completely changed how I felt. That part of me, that child part of me that was still feeling this, was still playing it out. And now when I train, and this is a few years ago now. So for the last 2-3 years with me for training is simply a celebration of my own power, of what I'm capable of. It's not a mechanism. It's not a means of survival. It's not a means of proving to my kind of parent who wasn't there that I'm capable, or to my mom even to say, that I can hold up anything. You don't need to worry. Instead, it's just for me. It's just what I used to empower myself and to get better and to challenge myself. And I love it more than ever, and that block that was starting to fill my training with a lot of anger and a lot of frustration melted away, and now training is the happiest part of my day. And my relationships with both my parents are a lot better as well, So
And I guess that's just because it was ingrained, right? Like you've ingrained that over the years.
And that's my point about all of this. And I hope that this example has condensed it a little bit. This is a belief that I had when I was a child that wasn't true. I made it up as a child to make sense of my world, to make sense of the position that I was in.
You didn't understand it. You just did it.
Yeah. All of these parts that we talk about, these narratives, these stories that we create as children, right, are to make sense of the world that is confusing and crazy to us, especially around trauma, right? And then we grow into adulthood, and then the story's still there, but the circumstances have changed, right?
Yeah. The thing is, as well, as we become adults, like children, as we all know, children tell the truth, and whatever children make of something is factual, isn't it? It's like me and Sarah always have a joke about like kids saying like Leo can't talk, but Nelly will just say whatever she sees. And that's the thing, isn't it? So when you're a child, you just act on what you think should be acted on. It's not experienced steps, is it? It's just what you think. So actually, yeah, like you're saying, you're ingraining that from a young age, and that's just how you've then become into the position you are now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's crazy. And I really want to illustrate this in this call, like how much that actually plays a role in the person you become, and especially when it's divisive, when it's traumatic, but it really isn't necessarily linked to trauma. It can be, because remember, a child's perception of trauma can be very different from another, could literally just be an offhand comment, or it could be like they got lost in the supermarket. That's a trauma to a child. It can be, or it can be something like a divorce or a death, or something more obvious, right? But the best thing, like a metaphor that I find illustrates this point very well about these beliefs that become stored in our unconscious, right, is imagine if you if someone gave you a pair of a t-shirt that you wore when you were 5, right? What would it look like on you?
It wouldn't fit.
It would look ridiculous, right? But yet so many people, all of us, myself included, yourself included, have walked around wearing one of those t-shirts. It doesn't fit, but then imagine believing that t-shirt, you yourself are walking around in that tiny t-shirt and you think, no, this is my shirt. This is the t-shirt that I want to wear, right? Well, obviously no, it doesn't fit, right? And that's how those beliefs play out. They don't make sense anymore. They're old. they're inconsequential even, right? But
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
But your subconscious and then ultimately your conscious mind totally believes that this is how I need to be. Because if not, again, we go back to this paradigm of like, it's easier to believe the lie than it is to question, right? What the hell does the shirt look like that I meant to wear, right?
Yeah.
But the answer is, and this is when like, coaching comes in, anything you want, man.
Yeah, that's true. And also it's about that whole, like, I think not trying to be what you think you should be, and the norm, or it's even, I know we're slightly off track, but it's even like that whole 2.4 children scenario, like, oh, I should get married because everyone gets married. I should have 2 children, I should have a dog and that sort of thing. I know it's slightly different from what we're talking, but still, it's just, you don't want to be forced into something you think should be. You literally want to wear your own t-shirt, like however you see it.
Yeah, and then if you were to take those examples, even though that, yeah, it's somewhat a different strain, but it's the same kind of thing. You look back and you ask yourself, like, wait a minute, why am I conditioned to think that I should be married at this age? What belief do I have around marriage? I'm gonna look at that a little bit. I'm gonna take some time and investigate, like, because it's interesting when you ask it about yourself as well. Like, what would it mean to me then if I wasn't married at that age? Challenge the belief, because often when you challenge a belief, you then get a more visceral response. You physically feel it, actually, oftentimes. Which is another topic for another video. I don't want to dump into that today, but that's another thing we can definitely talk about, is your reaction, your physical reaction and your emotional reaction to when you do this kind of thing, right? And another thing that I want to say is, again, this is why we're here with this series. This is why I'm here in what I do for a living, because this is the journey that we help to navigate people on, right? Because just like in the metaphor, of which there have been many, admittedly, but you are ultimately the pilot of your own plane, and that's the goal. But in order to get to that step, that's where we'll hopefully offer some guidance that can be helpful.
Yeah, to be aware of your current situation. So
yeah,
the last thing then, I mean, obviously we haven't got a massive amount of time left, but the last thing really then is like the why. So let's dig into this why. So, for me, I'll kick it off, like, for something that I often think about. But, so often people will say to me they've lost their motivation, they've lost their mojo, they fell off the wagon, all these different terms that people use. And I always come back to the whole, why are you doing what you're doing? So, it's so important to understand, like, why people do what they do if they want to succeed in where they're going. Because at the end of the day, if you're following suit, or if you're doing something for a reason that doesn't mean a lot to you, you're then not going to put 100% in, and you're going to struggle to pluck up the courage to fight regardless. Like, when, like, for example, like, just to put things into like easy terms for myself, like, when training gets hard, when dieting gets hard, when I used to cook for 90s, not no more, but but when things start to get into a struggle, if your why isn't important enough, you will soon hang up your gloves, and you'll give up a lot easier. So, it's such a huge thing to understand your why. And also, like, to add to it, if you don't know your why, then discover it. And that sort of takes us a little bit back to that whole, creating awareness. But it's all about trying to ask yourself the questions why you do what you do. Someone said to me once, why are you into strength training? And mine's very similar to yours, Scott, to be honest. Like, at the end of the day, I want to leave a legacy to be strong. I want people to think Dean was strong, for some inner reasons of not feeling that I was a strong person when I was young. But ultimately, I want to be known as being strong, because I've once felt in quite a weak position. A lot to do, like I say, with my youthhood and stuff. But the why, is so important, isn't it? And people need to understand why for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like, in the example that you've given, you boil it down to a very basic and very kind of ultimately a very simple concept, is that it was born out of a vulnerability that you didn't believe that you could be strong, or that it was something that was possible for you. And through examination and processing, and you found your own way of portraying that and exemplifying that, not just as a strength athlete, but as a coach and as a leader and as a mentor, right? And that's phenomenal, right? And that is an example of kind of breaking your conditioning, of going back and rewriting your story, right? And through processing those things, which obviously we're not going to get into here, which you have said you've done, with therapists or in the past, right? And really oftentimes it boils down to that. And this is my kind of takeaway point. You'll ask someone a question and they'll say, why do you want to be strong? Oh, because I want to be like Brian Shaw, or I want to be big and jacked, and they're very kind of simple answers, really, right? But and when you boil it down, it can end up in these long stories like what I just expressed to you, what you expressed last week. But when you do that, you can often find a simple line, a simple phrase about yourself, which is a part of yourself, kind of, it's communicating, right? And in the case of myself, given that I've given my example today, it is simply that there was a part of me that believed at one point that being strong was the only thing I could be to survive, right? That was it. And that was very counterintuitive, very negative, because it's born out of survival. When I tweaked that a little bit, when I changed that, it became, I'm strong because there is no reason for me not to be, because I have infinite potential. I have, courage, fucking desire, and I believe in myself, and I want to express that in this way through overcoming obstacles physically and also in my profession as well, right? And so that manifested positively for me. And so that idea is where I fall back all the time, no matter what happens. And little things can change, training can change, circumstances can change, goals can change, but that remains the same.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think it's that whole, like it's I think it's also the overcoming, isn't it? Like, to be able to overcome things. Like, at the end of the day, to overcome something is strength. Like, it makes you feel resilient and strong. And for me, that's a big factor to it, because I mean, obviously, when I came out of the army, I got told I won't be able to squat and stuff. So for me, I was like, right, I need to squat. You could call it rebellious or whatever, but at the end of the day, it was something that I wanted to overcome and prove, I guess. And I think often, like, when I get challenges in life, I work better because of that whole mentality that I've built up to be strong, to have that all-round strength in mindset and in physical. But I think it plays, it plays a big part, doesn't it, in people's lives to try and, to fix things as such, to try and overcome things. And if people can try and, as opposed to, I don't want to go off on a complete, like, different direction here, but as opposed to being that victim and sort of like having that victim mentality, if people can try and, have that fight mentality, that fight or flight sort of syndrome thing, and then obviously you will succeed a lot better in life.
Yeah, and then to condense that, the essential caveat is that they are conscious of why they're doing it, what is driving them, and if when we speak about like victim mindsets and that kind of thing, what that vulnerability is, right? Has that been processed and addressed, which is essential to be able to properly move forward consciously, or has it been bypassed and kind of ignored and buried? Because that is the most important thing with this, okay? It's a very slow process, but it's about authentic change. It's not about temporary change. It's about addressing, peeling back those layers, facing those difficult truths, right? And bit by bit, allowing that story to evolve in a way that suits the person that you are, right? Or the best part, the most substantial part of you. I call it in Jungian psychology, it's referred to as the higher self, right? And that is that's where you want to be the pilot of the plane, as opposed to the ego, and the subconscious, right? And the unconscious.
Yeah, agree. Well, Scott, my friend, I think we better wrap, because as always, we could probably go on for another half an hour.
We could indeed. Fantastic, man. I hope we touched on quite a lot of context today. less so strategies, but hopefully this will give people some insight into this process, why it's important, and what it means for you. And we will definitely be touching on this again in the future.
Yeah, 100%, man. We've covered some really good stuff. Just to give people an idea, like the next one, we're going to be looking at dealing with pressure and failure. So which I'm sure will be a really, really good episode as well. But for now, we will love you and leave you, and we'll catch you soon.
Yes, indeed.
Peace out.